Fellow travelers, we return after some weeks' sojourn to the Magic Mountain, where we are immediately greeted by two of the most redoubtable and doubtful friends of ours on the mountain. First of all, the weather, which turns to snow in August, to the wonder and perplexity of the good Hans Castorp. And Herr Settembrini, our pedagogue friend, whom we quickly meet on a walk, and who, not for the first time in our new acquaintance, crosses intellectual swords, if one will, with Hans Castorp. This time they are talking about illness and health. You can see why they might be talking about this. And Herr Settembrini has some things to say that might sit rather badly with certain modern sensibilities, things that might immediately raise modern hackles in my political world anyway as ableist. This is ableist discourse. Settembrini is saying it is always better to be healthy than to be ill. There is nothing redeeming about illness. There is nothing elegant about it. There's nothing elevating about it. There is nothing to be revered, to be certainly not envied, anything of the sort about illness. Bodily illness or illness of the soul, as an interlocutor who hovers about this portion of the text and much of this text might put it, health and illness of the soul. We will turn to that in a moment. First of all, though, I wanted to look closely at what Herr Settembrini is saying and why. Not so much to diffuse any charges of ableism in what he is saying, so much perhaps as to complicate them. I think my defense will end up being something like, he's not being ableist, he's being proto-fascist and ableist. And anti-fascist. That clears things up, right? You're welcome. Seriously, though, part of what Herr Settembrini is responding to is something that we as readers are accountable to in what Hans Castorp has just said. But Settembrini is likely unaware of, unless he has already been able to discern all of this about his new friend. What we know is that when Hans Castorp says what he says, that gets Settembrini going about health and illness. Hans Castorp says, it is strange for someone to be sick and stupid. He says, I don't know whether I'm putting it right, but it seems to me very peculiar for someone to be stupid and sick besides. And when the two are joined, it's surely the most pitiful thing in the world. One doesn't know what sort of face to put on. Because for someone who's ill, one wants to express a certain seriousness and deference, doesn't one? Illness has something more or less venerable about it, if I may put it that way. But, he says, when someone like Frau Stöhr at his table, Frau Stöhr of the malapropisms, is sick and stupid, it proposes, in Hans Castorp's words, a dilemma for our human emotions. We don't know whether to laugh or cry. There's no rhyme or reason to it, he says. They don't, sickness and stupidity, belong together. One is not used to picturing them together. He says, one assumes stupid people must be healthy and vulgar, and that illness must ennoble people and make them wise and special. At least that's what one normally thinks, is it not? I've probably said more than I can defend, he concludes correctly. Now, we have an idea why Hans Castorp says these things. We might remember his grandfather, who is a noble and antiquated, in a good way, personage throughout his life, the culmination of whose perfection is in the solemnity of his death, when he is laid out in a Spanish rough and ceremonial garb, just like he is in his ceremonial portrait. So that during his decline, of which young Hans Castorp, as we learned, is spared the most bitter, physical, graphic details, he comes to see death as this ennobling thing, the thing that causes grandfather to resemble his authentic perfection, to wear the Spanish ruff that you don't actually wear every day, even in such a rarefied world as the Tinapel and Castorp homes in northern Germany with their proper North German manners that Hans Castorp would have been used to. So from there, from something around that experience, not just the cultural manners, but Hans Castorp's particular experience as someone thrice orphaned young, that the respectability of death becomes a thing in his discourse. Settembrini probably doesn't know that, although it doesn't matter terribly, one way or the other. Settembrini comes in with what we might discern to be a view expressive of his take on Enlightenment values. To say, no, illness is not good, illness is bad. There is nothing to be celebrated in illness. There is nothing about the degradation of body or soul or anything that is anything but degrading and degradation. It is not part of progress, it is not part of enlightenment, it is not part of ennoblement, it is not part of learning, it is not part of pedagogy. Nothing about knowledge requires illness or any kind of degradation. That's Settembrini. Now, one could certainly bristle at that. Before one bothers, I think one might begin by asking, what is Settembrini doing on this mountain? How ill is he really? How do these reflections apply to his own life? Do they apply to his own life? Well, certainly they do. All of that, then, is to say that, yes, there is something quite disturbing to a modern politics of ability or disability that could be very ruffling in Settembrini's speech. And it isn't not ruffling, it's simply ruffling on such a big scale that I would not want to do anything to hem in what is either problematic or perhaps a bit prophetic in what Settembrini is saying. Because part of what it means for Settembrini to be doubling down against illness as some sort of desideratum, some sort of virtuous condition, part of what that means is for him to be taking a stance against what he perceives as a kind of medieval threat that still lurks in recidivist, reactionary corners of the world, and we will explore those corners of the world here on the mountain. We will. For the moment, though, Settembrini would have, Hans Castorp would have everyone under his influence have nothing whatever to do with the kind of medieval sensibility that subjugates the world, humanity, thought, everything earthly, to something worse than the heavenly, something worse than God. That's a medieval, anti-humanistic, anti-humane viewpoint, as Settembrini is receiving it. Settembrini might be a classic example of what we can call the dialectic of enlightenment, because there comes to be something so restrictive, so exclusive in his view of what is good for humanity, what is a good body, what is a good health, what is a good soul. At the same time, we will also note that in this novel, illness often means something that's a bit like political virality. Illness is a bit like the spread of fascism. So, this is why I've said that Settembrini is not being ableist, he's being proto-fascist and anti-fascist and ableist. Joking, not joking. There is perhaps still yet to be explained about what I have said, particularly why I have called anything proto-fascist about this. Maybe that's already obvious. Anyway, we'll return to all of that. Right now, we're going to look at what I think the novel, over and above Settembrini, over and above Hans Castorp, has to say, or better, to ask, about the health and illness of the soul. I'm going to read a little bit from Nietzsche, The Gay Science. This section is called The Health of the Soul. Actually, I'll read the excerpts that I prepared. There is no health as such. There are innumerable healths of the body. Excerpts from a longer paragraph that I will post. We have to consider not just the health and illness of the body, the health and illness of the soul, Nietzsche writes. There's a great question of whether we can really dispense with illness, whether our thirst for knowledge, Nietzsche writes, our thirst for knowledge and self-knowledge in particular, does not require the sick soul as much as the healthy, and whether, in brief, the will to health alone is not a prejudice, a cowardice, and perhaps a bit of very subtle barbarism and backwardness. Of that, Settembrini can be very well accused in Nietzschean terminology, to which the novel, I feel, over and above its characters, is sympathetic. Also, in this encounter with Settembrini, moving away from the theme of illness and health per se, we have the cousin's general reaction to him, which is ambivalent as before. There's something abashing, something embarrassing, something surprising about the ways that he takes seemingly innocent things that they, particularly Hans Castorp, who keeps stepping in it, say. Settembrini specifically calls Hans out on just kind of saying stuff, trying things out simply because they have stumbled on the subject. Settembrini has a phrase for it, placet experiri. I believe this comes from Petrarch, though I can't produce a citation. But Settembrini, when he says placet experiri, he's taking in something about the character of young Hans Castorp's young ways of thinking, which is to say, Hans Castorp enjoys, at this point in his life, entertaining different ideas, many of which are completely new to him, or recently new to him. Trying them out, trying them on for size. Settembrini sees this and says, it is suitable in your age. Describes a young man's intellect not as a blank page, but as a page in which all the ideas are already written in differently appealing inks. Here Settembrini plants a seed, referring back to the conversation they had on a previous meeting about pedagogy, about Settembrini says, one cannot deny the pedagogue the part of his nature, the instinct to pass on, to perhaps coerce his beliefs onto someone else. Placet expediere, he's saying, enjoy your intellectual romps, but ultimately there is a right answer. I know it. You, my good engineer, as yet do not. Therefore, enjoy your explorations, but what I have to say, imprint on your mind, he says this twice, imprint this on your mind. There's a number of repetitions in the language around Settembrini in this chapter that's very revealing. Twice we have him say in these, with this sort of scriptural injunction, imprint this on your minds. Twice we have him in the same language, rocking his head back and forth in enjoyment, physical enjoyment of the Italian language that he is remembering, that he is thinking of, or that he's reciting the second time. The language melts on the tongue, auf der Zunge zergeht, like chocolate, that same phrase, twice. There's a couple of more things that are reinforced through this kind of, these linguistic pairs, these doublets in this chapter surrounding Settembrini. One of them is that we return to his word graphic. Settembrini drops this word in a previous conversation where Hans Castorp has said to him, "Why, Herr Settembrini, you're so droll and sarcastic." And Herr Settembrini says, instead of sarcastic, he says, "Perhaps you mean malicious, boshaft." And he says, "Yes, perhaps I am a little malicious. Boshaft bin ich ein wenig." And then he talks about what he means by that maliciousness, Bosheit, he says, in that sense, are about criticism, are about taking apart what is wrong, what is not right, and clearing it away. That's this maliciousness is the spirit of criticism, Settembrini says. That seems to be kind of what he is talking about when he says here, or when he says earlier, that his way of speaking is malicious and graphic, plastic, are both words that Settembrini supplies for his own way of thinking when he's trying to give the cousins words for when they say, "Oh, Herr Settembrini, your way of speaking is so. These are the words he gives: malicious, boshaft, and graphic, plastic. Malicious is a word that ties us to that Satan, that satanic discourse that comes with Settembrini. The word plastic, graphic, I'm a little more confused by and have been for years. Perhaps in this reading I will satisfy myself with some account of what is meant by graphic. Plastic means, like the word graphic in English, material in a sense. Plastic, like the plastic art, something you can see. There's a stuff, a matter to it, and there seems to be an idiomatic correlation between saying the graphicness of a turn of phrase, of a speech, of a description in English, and plastische Sprache, or something of that kind, in German. Now, what is graphic about Settembrini's speech so far seems to be this sort of malicious quality. But there is not any blood or gore in what he has been saying. Therefore, there's a part of me that continues to wonder, even realizing that a graphic may, chiefly in a contemporary sense of mine, be related to bloodiness and gore. However, though, my question remains a bit, what's graphic about Settembrini's style of speech? It's not particularly vision-inflected in what we are saying right now, except where it is. That's quite a vivid description of his father's study that he has. Is that, however, what's meant by plastic, a word that's going to recur? I'm not really sure. We're going to have to continue and see. For the moment, all I can say is that this gives us a little bit of purchase on how it can be that Settembrini is at once this character associated with a kind of satanic presence, partly because of his Carducci poem that comes up earlier, partly also because the characteristic of Mephistopheles in Faust, one of the most pertinent forms of devilry for present purposes, is that Mephistopheles is the spirit of negation. Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint. Und das mit Recht. Denn alles, was entsteht, ist wert, dass es zugrunde geht. In this translation, I am the spirit that negates, and rightly so, for all that comes to be deserves to perish wretchedly. Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint. you get a reflection of this in what Hans Castorp says when he says that Settembrini is a naysayer who hacks away at everything around him. Joachim introduces an interesting kind of dialectical doubling back, saying, yes, he does have this way of tearing things down, but he actually does not have a chaotic way of doing that as Hans Castorp seems to initially imply. Hans Castorp says it makes things untidy and disorderly. Unverwahrlostes is the German word, I believe. And Joachim says actually he's quite orderly, he's quite rigorous and tidy. Actually, rigorous is Hans Castorp's word. Joachim leads him to it. There's a method to the madness. And, moreover, a decency. He's a man with a lot of self-respect, Settembrini is, Joachim says. Or better, respect for people in general. And I like that about him. There's something decent about that as I see it. You're right, Hans Castorp says. There's even something rigorous about him. So this is how we have the cousins processing this kind of dual polarity of Settembrini. On the one hand, the malicious, the boshaft, the tearing down, the hacking away. On the other hand, the humanism, the decency, the warmth, the part of him that is able to just, and perhaps this is where the graphicness comes in, bring you in to his father's warm study, where you yourself could cry the tears of joy. Settembrini describes that feeling, the blanket of warmth draped over your shoulders, a respite, a relief from the biting cold, wherein warmth as well as literature, humanity in that sense, envelops you in its comforting embrace. These are the two sides of Settembrini that make, well, these are only a small part of what make him such an interesting character to me, but I hope this sets us up to see a bit into what is troubling about his language in this chapter, to see why it is indeed troubling, but perhaps for more reasons than the ones that present themselves offhand in a modern context. And I hope this sets us up to continue, especially, observing the progress that Settembrini and Hans Castorp make as teacher and student, or something of the kind, together. That's it for now. Thanks, friends.